Alright, for observers, please should silence your phone. Not about when the if there is nothing else, if I need to hear.
Right, starting speech in 3, 2, 1. In every band motion, the thing that I want my opponents to argue is probably that you want to hear is that how do we regulate this instead? But we say that regulations stems it only, but we cannot solve it. So why can't states regulate? I'm going to tell you exactly why. Why do we need to ban it instead, right? Because first of all, corporate expansion increases lobbying power because they eventually get rich. Even if the bloating is slower, they still are gaining money from whatever businesses that they get into. So it's a slowly but surely process that eventually these kinds of corporations will get so much money that they will increase the amount of influence, power, and financial resources that have at their disposal. They're able to change what states can allow. And this is going to be primarily what my speech is going to be talking about, how it influences housing prices, how it prices out poor people from getting accessible housing. I'm going to give you further analysis as to why this actually happens in these kinds of places, right? So let's take a look at how do these actually corporate landlords, these kind of places that they buy are going to look like. Because first, another thing that we are fine with under our side of the house is that we are fine with three things. One, having individual landlords. One, we're okay with state regulations. Two, we're okay with individual home ownership, right? So what corporate landlords actually do is that they actually have less kinds of accountability because the form of bureaucracy that happens when this kind of thing is. Because when you have strong corporations doing that, they probably have a monopoly or a lot of control over the management of these kinds of places. People find it harder and harder to find them, to hold them accountable towards any problems that crop up when they are staying at these kinds of apartments, right? Because like if your lift rosa or if your pool smells like something died in it, or maybe there's a dog that hung itself off the balcony, let's get it over with. I give you three things as to what we are fine with: individual landlords, state regulation, individual home ownership. Okay, I'll give you guys later one more. Okay. Okay. So anyways, so either way, they make it very hard for people to just access the type of help that landlords under our side of the house would probably be more amenable to. That you can actually get help in order to fix the problems in your house because they own it to begin with. Right? So monopoly is bad. Why is this monopoly bad also? And what kind of client base do they get? The client base that most of these corporate landlords would want in order to maximize profits because they're companies is that they want the higher to upper middle class in order to buy it. They will price out poor people and therefore makes housing less accessible. And more likely than not, because they want to be more strategic, they're going to buy up extremely strategic apartments in urban areas or suburban areas that people value the most because it's probably much more proximate towards where their children study, where they work, or where they get their groceries from. And then the other thing about this kind of thing is that they are more likely going to encourage the kind of sustainable ecosystem in this kind of in these kind of places that they stay. So because what they want to do is that in the end they are still competitive, right? These corporations, they don't want other people to go and buy houses in other corporate owned places, apartments and these kind of things. So what this how this sustainable ecosystem looks like, for those of you in Ipoh, it looks like Botani. For those of you in yes, for those of you who live in Selangor, I guess Sunway City, some other examples that Raymond told me but doesn't ring a bell in my head right now. But basically it looks like this. You have commercial areas within this kind of residential areas. It becomes so sustainable that people never have to leave this kind of area to get anything they want. They get their groceries, they get their food. Yeah, get it over.
So Sunway is getting more and more expensive. What happens when people cannot afford to live in the apartments that your corporation controls? Hey.
Wait, we want to ban corporation landlords. So stop! You guys crazy. All right. So, anyways, so in other words, Also, additional analysis as to why corporations want to do that. Because they want to sell it to upper and higher middle class people, they want to make sure that the vibe and aesthetic of this place is correct. So in other words, they will attract more and more corporations that fit this kind of aesthetic. So they'll want more expensive corporations to go and open shop there. Since I'm from Ipoh, I assume Sam's Grocer and Jaya Grocer is the more upscale version of grocery instead of an Aeon Grocer lah. So I assume it looks like that. So because it fits more towards the pricing point of the kind of people that you want there, and you also make people that, this is the kind of place that I would usually go to go and buy my groceries, or the type of businesses that I would engage with anyway, because this is within my social economic circle, right? So therefore, I would probably live somewhere where it's close to these kind of places. So in other words, you will go and force people, you would make it so that these kinds of places fit that kind of aesthetic, so you can justify these extremely high pricing points on that, right? So these kinds of self-sustaining residential ecosystems are just going to encourage gentrification. They have their own commercial areas. Stuff becomes much more expensive because corporations want other big businesses to come open there, right? Additional thing that's going to happen is the first mover advantage, because you can develop it however you want. They're going to geographically lock these kind of places to make other forms of development unfeasible. And we tell you this is a problem that interferes with state zoning, right? Because more likely than not, your states are going to already manage infrastructure to say, like, where's the residential area, where's the commercial area, and how do we get there, and then arrange bus routes and train routes and whatever it is. But then after that, all these corporations come up and jam up the whole thing, because they're going to build and self-sustaining ecosystems in whatever places that they want, and they don't necessarily have to agree to whatever that the state wants, or that even if when they cannot regulate it because of what I talked about earlier in my the first minute of my speech about how corporations have lobbying power, they have a lot more financial resources to make it happen. We think that this means that it's going to render infrastructure that cities have built probably moot or largely ineffective. It can disrupt economic efficiencies at the end of the day. And this is ultimately very, very bad, right? So even if you don't sell to actual people who want to own a home, these kinds of landlords corporate landlords are going to sell to people who want to buy this to become Airbnbs, or buy these houses to rent or flip it for other people for profit. Either way, this leads to an increasing in housing inflation, because at the end of the day, your housing developers are going to realize that, the people who are going to be our main customers aren't going to be your regular Joe who's going to take a housing loan in order to afford a home, but it's going to be huge corporations with a load of money that can buy my kind of places. So I'm going to build it, upscale it, to drag in bigger whales or bigger fish in order to purchase my kind of homes that I'm building for them. In other words, at the end of the day, regular people aren't able to go and buy these kinds of homes. Your developers are never going to build affordable housing under their side of the house, right? So in other words, this creates a monopoly. There's going to be there's going to be a monopoly at the end of the day, right? So at the end of our case here, we're going to prove to you why is it that corporation landlords are going to cause more trouble for not only just the regular person on the ground who's unable to access houses, but also mess up with the state, and also why is it that ultimately this is an extremely unethical thing to exist to begin with. Thank you.
John, do you want your...
Oh, that.
I'm audible, right? Starting my speech in 3, 2, One. I think Chan thinks that corporations have way more power than they actually do, right? Especially when we look at it objectively. I think firstly, like on Chan's thing about how corporations have lobbying power and this lobbying is like going guaranteed to work, right? I don't think that's necessarily the case, right? Because firstly, like that there will always be pushback from renters, from people who are actually like getting this housing, right? Like there's always going to be like regulation because of the political capital. Like your politician isn't going to fuck over their voter base just because some corporation is offering to pay them like this amount of money, right? Because in the end you will receive pushback from your voter base. Like they wouldn't want this. At worst you get things like protests, which have happened in the past before anyway, right? And you obviously don't want this. Secondly, later on in my speech, I'll explain why like corporations don't necessarily even have an incentive to like over the people that they're renting out to, and why that's necessarily not true. But also just to respond to Chan a bit more, like for his thing about like Sunway, like the problem is just that Sunway has too much. They own too much, right? And there is no regulation. There is no rent control in Sunway, right? Like, so Sunway housing has no rent control. There is nothing that is necessarily like regulating this, and that's why regulation is so important. What is our counterfactual then? Reform. We want more regulation. We want like corporations to be regulated, and we believe that it's much easier to regulate like these corporations it's much easier to regulate these corporations rather than just like individual housing, right? Okay, why like we want things like rent control and zoning control. Like if corporations want to build in like rural areas, like they will like get tax breaks, which will also incentivize them to not like hike up their prices to like an extreme amount, right? Because like if the problem is then like Chan says that like corporations is going to make this so ridiculously expensive for people. Like nobody's going to buy your housing if it's so ridiculously expensive, right? Like it's better for like renters as a whole, because like if multiple corporations have like housing in like the same place, this creates the competition. They have incentives to compete with each other to get to the lowest price point, to make sure that it's affordable to people so that they actually make a profit, right? Not only that, different corporations also will just adopt different niches in the market. Different people want like different types of prices, right? Like you then as a corporation have the ability to like sell like a lot of apartments for cheap, like and sell more apartments then, or sell more housing, right? Or you can sell less for like a higher price, like, and this will exist because they would want people to buy anyway, so they have to make it affordable for people, right? And the regulation then would just like on our side, when the regulation exists, we create greater accountability for these corporations, and this is particularly important, right? Because corporations, more often than not, yeah, Chan.
Even if regular people don't buy it, your investors who are riding the residential bubble, it will cause inflation that will harm poor people anyway.
I don't think that this is necessarily true. Jian Cheng will deal with that later in this video. Okay, so moving on, like corporations are accountable to like profit and profit first, right? And especially when they are on the receiving ends of like tax breaks, like even if there is no tax break and they don't get any benefit from this, if it's too expensive, they just won't like make it too expensive, because then people won't buy, right? Because their main incentive is for people to continue to buy housing. This also like is important because housing is such an important issue right now, right? Because young people especially are not able to buy, like actually get housing now, especially quality housing. No, thank you. Like especially quality housing, right? Like because there's so many problems with like the housing that you can get in Sunway, for example. When you're renting out these apartments, like even if it's like from an individual, you still get things like discrimination. If you're a woman, if you're a minority, these are still like issues that will like typically exist on like their side of the house, right? Like, which also makes it like a bipartisan issue. People do care because because of these minorities that get discriminated against, and this is why people do want better regulation, and why it's okay to have like corporate residential landlords, like, and why we don't see why there's a necessity for a total ban of corporate residential landlords, right? Because it then means that like you have instances of like discrimination happening on like a wider scale, and we say that this is bad. We don't want this to happen, right? Because like young people also want the flexibility to be able to move where they want, like, and this is only possible through like renting these types of apartments or renting this type of housing, right? Because sometimes people just don't have the capital, or they don't necessarily just want to settle down and create roots somewhere and buy housing in this manner, right? Where like Chan talks about, like, okay, and this is like particularly important as well, because only on our side, when like you have like these like reform and regulation, and the government does have incentive to make sure that these regulations are like instilled onto these corporations because like they don't want to lose their voter base, because they don't want that kind of backlash, because housing is an issue that affects everyone, right? Like you need housing no matter who you are, like, and people will push back and people will like make their political decisions based on their ability to get housing, right? Because like then like if this is an issue that affects everyone, governments are just like more likely to care. They will like impose these regulations onto corporations. Sure, Chan.
Yeah, but poor people lack political capital to achieve change anyways. So you have to analyze it with the scale of probability people don't get change. And also people aren't exactly single issue voters. They're not going to base their votes based on this side.
But the problem is just housing is such a big issue, like it's something that affects them so heavily. If you got no home and you cannot live anywhere, or if the place that you're living is like just extremely bad and like the place is just like, you know, leaking all the time, your shower doesn't work, you cannot like live a proper life, like that's something that people do care about, and care about enough that it would change their political opinions. It would change the way that they vote, right? And like, says that poor people got no political capital, like they still have the ability to vote, they still have the ability to like collectivize and talk about these issues and talk about how like, you know, they get like they hate the place that they're living in and they wish that things were better, and they would exercise like their power to speak up, because like especially when there is so many people going through this, right? Because the problem on their side is that when it's like unregulated, like they claim that they have regulation in this manner, but this doesn't necessarily exist on their side. And like when it doesn't exist, like the problem is then like people will collectivize, people will talk about it, people will push back against their politicians and want to like have change in that manner, right? Like, and poor people will be able to do this, minorities will be able to do this, but like on at the very least on our side, like your minorities and people who like need housing and deserve housing will always be able to get like affordable housing somewhat, right? Especially in places like the, I don't know, like in cities where like that's where the jobs are, that's where like your education is, like this is like particularly important, right? You want housing there, you want it to be affordable so that you can like get better opportunities for yourself and for your life, like, and that this is only possible if you have affordable housing in these places particularly. And for all those reasons, oppose.
The opposition just keep having it.
The problem with this opposition's team is that they seem to have very superficial and under-explained analysis to explain why exactly the harms that we have is going to be protected through, I don't know, a bunch of people waving signs on the street. It's very unclear what exactly is the proper mechanism that they explain that allows for governments to be incentivized to actively stick towards the protests of poor people that have no time to actually vote in the public lobbies or like continue like sacrifice time from work. And like if everything that they're explaining from us from their case is true, in that there's a lot of incentive for governments to, I don't know, like ensure that like people on the ground are staying to vote and people on the ground are continuing to vote for like in favor of them for regulations. It does not contend with the analysis on the power dynamics between corporations and the general media, or the ability to influence individuals on the ground to make sure that housing isn't a primary voting factor in their calculus. There are a few strategic pieces of analysis that I want to explain before in terms of engagements before moving on to expansion. First of all, to note that the vast majority of the opposition's analysis is heavily under-elaborated in terms of how they plan to actually establish a step-by-step layer to address our harms. Elmo's analysis to explain why exactly it is that companies will not gentrify these areas and will not drive up the cost of living was severely underwhelming. Chan gave you layer after layer of why horizontal expansion is something that is inevitable when it comes to corporations like owning these residential areas. Why the profit incentive of these companies will constantly allow for them to continue practicing a collusive and a continually pervasive impact that allows for them to continually drive up prices by attracting richer individuals to start entering because they have more money to offer, they have more money to give, and therefore companies that do not care about the poor, do not care about the middle class, have far more incentive to cater these residential areas towards the people that can give them more money instead. What exactly was the analysis? They said people won't buy. Someone has to buy these residential areas, and therefore they are not going to do so. First of all, there is zero consideration for target market in a myriad on a broad spectrum that is different socioeconomic classes. Opposition's case would work maybe if everyone was in the same tax bracket, but we literally just told you why there is a severe disconnect between the individuals that they want to fight for and the individuals that corporations actually care about. You know the reason why corporations do not cater towards individuals of the middle class or towards individuals in the lower class? Because these people do not have as much money to offer as the rich as investors and will be able to give them millions of dollars by selling them this sort of rent. So in this case, there is particularly a significantly large, like there's a huge disconnect in terms of what they have to prove. They need to explain to us why exactly the corporations on their side are likely going to act in the interest of middle class voters, in the interest of lower class individuals that have less utility towards these corporations. Somehow, I don't know, good luck Ryan or Yan Cheng, like you guys can give the analysis lah. But also secondly, I just want to note as well that in terms of the analysis on backlash, a lot of it has zero impact. I low-key don't know what exactly their plan is after people, I don't know, get angry at the government because like housing is like really expensive these days. Because the analysis that they give is just a bunch of people are going to protest and maybe the government will listen. Maybe corporations will get scared and will no longer lobby the government because the people are collectivizing to the power of friendship. Like they need this very vague mechanism. Why is this mechanistically flawed? First of all, I told you in the start of the speech, the vast majority of the individuals that they're talking about are going to have politics at the forefront of their minds. If they're constantly fighting to find a way for them to find a house, if they're constantly fighting to find a way for them to find affordable goods because the corporations have driven up prices of living so far up, their priority isn't going to go to the ballot box and spend multiple hours away from work voting for some government that they may or may not influence or change. It is to work 2 part-time jobs and to spend every single hour of the day slaving away for an extra amount of income. But secondly, we told you why. The government incentive actually isn't really about just whether or not people are waving angry signs on the street. I don't know what exactly is the actual link to get between this towards the full-on legislative change that they want to achieve. The idea here is corporations lobbies are extremely powerful in the government because their ability to bring a massive amount of money from rich demographics and investors provides a huge public image that is able to project at least a level of economic efficiency. So even if housing prices are up, who gives a fuck? Sorry, kids here. Who cares? I just contributed multiple millions of dollars and ringgit to the national economy, to the GDP. So because GDP prices are up, surely this government is economically efficient and is having good economic policy. This is the public projection of image that allows people to deceive voters in the millions. And the individuals that do not educate themselves about the real nuances of politics, do not educate themselves about the real nuances of how economics actually works, and are oftentimes the very individuals they said are going to protest are deceived by these corporations because they're the ones running the media. They're the ones being able to spread massive amounts of propaganda. They're the ones actively dominating airspaces and telling you that the government is doing good because your economy is doing fine. More MNCs are entering the country and Sunway City is prospering because there's they just opened another mall that offers really expensive apple crumble pies in Kenny Hills Bakers. That's crazy, right? So they need to explain to us why exactly it is that your backlash has any form of impact whatsoever. Until then, they have zero mechanism. Before I move on, sure.
Yeah, so rich people buy and own most of their properties. So why is it that corporations mainly target this group of people and not the largest group of people, which is the middle class?
Because I just told you that the middle class people do not have money to give to the corporations. The fact remains that even if it is these people that are owning the areas, there's a lot of people that want to invest in the real estate industry, right? So that is why usually it is the investors that are also working together with the corporations that are also getting these apartments together to be able to loan them out for things, for example, the workers that try to enter into the area. Even those workers will still be predated on because of the fact that it's geographically locked. Okay. Chan told you a lot about why the gentrification of these residential areas is an unstoppable force. I don't think I need to explain that much in terms of why horizontal expansion and gentrification of these areas is just entirely inevitable. Instead, I'm going to engage with Op at their best and expand even if you wanted to regulate things, what exactly is that you cannot regulate? First of all, your current motion, or your current fiat of the motion is not permanent. Because Chan told you, corporations' ability to gradually upscale and outpace you as they gradually exploit and monopolize the area means that even if you currently had the ability to ban them in the status quo, you will likely not be able to do so in the future. This is why even if it, like in the short term, it is like you are able to regulate them. Usually, it is the corporations that drive up decentralization, that drive up the amount of money going into the economy, that increasingly increase the amount of utility that they can portray in terms of political lobbying. It is the fact that this rapid gentrification and rapid developmentalization of these areas further outpaces the government's ability to match the corporation's ability, the corporation's inclusion. So for them to properly regulate, they have to prove why they can stop horizontal expansion. They have to stop gentrification, which undercuts their own actual benefits about whatever development and whatnot. I want to point out, so far has zero substantial benefit. Check your notes. They don't actually give you a reason for why these corporations are good. Insofar as they're unable to give to you anything that isn't a defensive mechanism, they're destined to lose the round.
Yeah.
I'm just gonna call out this gut team. What a fucking negative case. Holy shit. I have no idea what the fuck the counterfactual is coming from their side of the house. Because I legitimately have no idea who supplies apartments on their side of the house. It's either individual landlords and developers, but again, I'm pretty sure this is symmetrical on either side of the house because the scale of impact is significantly reduced. If you were to buy their case of state housing, which I guess is the correct case, they ultimately lose the debate. There are three things I want to talk about in this speech. Firstly, do people really want to own homes? Second, on why is it that corporations on our side of the house has better incentives to make apartments cheap and accessible. And second, I'll explain why is it that houses on our side of the house are better quality. First, I'll just explain whether or not they want to own homes. Look, I lost the framing battle in round 3 to this team, so I'll actually give actual structural reasons to suggest why individuals within the status quo want to rent and not own homes like they say. Why is it true that people want to rent more than owning homes? First reason is because it's cheaper. Look, shit is getting expensive and people cannot afford mortgages. The Strait of Hormuz has closed down and now all the fucking groceries are expensive. But even this isn't true. Like, if you want to target the specific actor that Yan Chen pointed out in his POI, it's likely to be the middle class or poorer income individuals because rich individuals are likely going to buy these homes and rent it anyways. So these are the main stakeholders we ought to prioritize. But guess what? These are individuals who are poor. These are individuals who have bad credit, which is why poorer people tend to be renters because they need the short-term immediate capital to buy groceries. They cannot afford mortgages because they have bad capital. But second, it's just flexibility. Within the status quo, we see starting trend of the younger generation wanting to have more flexibility when it comes to renting, which is why they're more than happy to trade off commitment in exchange for, not having to commit in settling down in a specific place. When they have a job opportunities across the other city, they have more freedom to move. If they find the love of their life in Kuala Lumpur, they're more likely to move to Sarawak because, I don't know, Sarawak is better, but it means that they are more likely to rent on outside the house as opposed to their side where they buy. So this just explains why the current status quo shifts towards renting. The second clash is on whether or not our mechanism of change has greater incentives to want to be cheap and accessible and cater towards the market. The first thing I'll do is to explain the positive case. Why is it that corporations are better on our side of the house? And that's for 3 structural reasons. The first independent reason is because of regulations, as Varsha pointed out. Guys, I know Varsha is pretty, but it doesn't mean that she's stupid. She gives actual reason and analysis. Look, political capital is important. You have protests and voting, but it's also quite important because when it comes to renting, for example, it's a bipartisan issue where the left obviously wants more affordable housing, right? Also want more affordable housing because all this impacts their state of livelihood. What this means then is that if you want to run the generic stock argument about lobbying doesn't work insofar individuals are affected and insofar people can look through the lies and bullshit that you say. Guys, I don't even need to use debate land logic for this. I can use real life. Look at New York City with Zohran Mamdani winning the fucking election. I also want to point out how convenient their frame is for some fucking reason. When corporations earn money, suddenly on our side of the house, they can lobby out regulations. But for some reason, on their side of the house, regulations are easier to manifest, and it's unclear to me why is that true. Second, even if you buy that political lobbying and all the political capital and incentive stuff we explain doesn't work, we explain absent of that, corporations still have incentive to want to make housing somewhat affordable. The reason why this is true is because of market mechanics. Look, corporations have different profit models. Some corporations are fine with having smaller margin as long as they sell more units of housing, which seems to suggest why they can cater towards affordable housing. Some corporations prioritize luxury living, which is why they want to earn more money per unit of sale. But this also means that corporations likely want to cater towards the specific market they're entering, right? And this is important because if companies know that one company is dominating urban living in urban cities, companies can just tap into rural markets and create affordable housing there instead of expensive housing. Because obviously a Sarawakian is not going to be able to afford like the $1 million apartments. We're going to afford like I guess $100 rent prices, and we think that's relatively okay. Third, media control is also not true, and the reason for this is because people are the actual victims of this circumstance, and this is just incredibly uncharitable. Because if that is true, it means that neither team can argue for any form of regulation or voter change. Why is this important in debate? It means that on outside the house, rent can be controlled, it can be cheap, and it can be affordable. Because guess what? If corporations know that the current market want affordable housing, the corporations can just tap into that affordable housing. If they know other corporations dominate one specific niche market, we agree that there are different markets and consumers of different socio-economic backgrounds. But this explains why you can tap into them too. But what's the negative case? I want to note their analysis does not work. Why is that true? Firstly, because if poor people don't have as strong as a political say as they say, this cuts into their case because it means that states don't have an incentive to cater to them. Because if states own housing, that means they're catered towards housing for the average median income, not for the minorities. Second, we also get an independent reason that even if the state does not care about poor people, corporations will, because of the materials of reasons that I just brought out. Why is this important? Firstly, it explains if it's true that voters have some political capital and they want forms of regulations, this is symmetrical. But this also seems to suggest why we can control corporations too. But second, we explain in the instance where the states do not care about poor people on the ground. Why is it that it's because they care about the majoritarian vote, they only care towards the median income, and why they don't care about minorities? We explain why corporations do, which is why they're likely to cater towards them as well. Before I move on, sure. Gelson.
What really? There are also people who can afford to live in waterfront, but people that also prefer to eat at chili pan mee as opposed to like getting those bakers because it's less expensive. So why exactly it is that the people that they're selling to are really poor?
Okay, this is the third final clash. Why are houses likely to be better quality? And this is the big impact of our case. Firstly, why is it that relying on corporations are better even if the instance where they are monopolies? Why is this true? Firstly, it's just economies of scale. What this means is that it's cheaper for corporations to build and rent more apartments. But this also means that they can reuse like same tractors and same machines to build and rent more of these things. Second is just the greater ability to capital. So they have loans and private companies, which means that have higher credit ratings, like they have good reputation with JP Morgan and their ability to get loans. Third, they also just have significant amount of capital, which seems to suggest why they can weather shitty conditions. If you were to buy the material on, inflation or crises, etc., these corporations can weather through that because they have the capital to rely on it. What is the impact of this material? Firstly, it's just you have better homes because corporations want to compete with each other, but it also means to suggest why is it they want to provide better quality homes and have the capacity to, assuming on both sides of the house within an incentive. But secondly, you have more state capital to spend on more things because now it's a corporation weathering this. So you can afford things like welfare, healthcare, and education. What is the negative case? Why is it that they cannot? Because on their side of the house, individual mechanizations are just regular developers, state-owned housing, and individual landlords. But what this means is that you get less capacity for good housing. On the outside of the house, you're not going to tap into markets like Chili Pan Mee or Waterfront. Instead, they're going to pick safe bets and safe consumers where they know they're likely to earn profit. But what this means is that you ignore the most vulnerable actors that live within these rural areas, which then increases housing. Because now all those rural areas have to go to the big city in order to get housing, higher degrees of prices. It means that homes reduce and livable homes reduce, which drives cost of living up. All the reasons, thank you.
thus far, opposition's case only mechanism as to why you get better regulation is people want good thing, government give good thing, and therefore people are able, and therefore you're able to get the kinds of regulation that this thing talks about. It is not enough to explain that oftentimes these individuals do not have sufficient political capital relative to corporations that often have huge amount of financial and political capital that's able to influence the way in which governments make the decisions. The first thing I'll talk about here is on how this bloats and financially empowers corporations in ways that are very, very harmful, and why is it particularly true real estate. Firstly, real estate industry are highly attractive and price inelastic, which allows corporations to be price makers in the industry, which allows them to squeeze out any disposable income from even the upper middle class individuals that are renting from these areas, which also allows them to be able to get huge amount of money. But secondly, corporations therefore also have other industries that are able to benefit from this also. This increase and significantly and the amount of political capital they have relative to disempowered rural individuals. But secondly, they shift the consumer base to upper middle class individuals or wealthy individuals that can afford more expensive housing in very strategic areas. Businesses therefore move away from more suburban areas to more urban or more urban gentrified areas, because that is the area where they're able to make the most amount of money from, and therefore people, in order for them to even access basic goods and basic services, for example, have to go to those areas also, which means that you create urban flows in these areas. So areas like Metro Manila, areas like Bangkok, areas like Bangsa, for example, becomes expensive, and people have to rely on those areas in order for them to get the goods that are necessary within their life. Secondly, let's talk about accountability. Firstly, it's unclear why corporations care about those that cannot afford these kinds of housing in the first place. You protest against the corporations, but they are not the main consumer base. So even you can protest as much as you want, but insofar as the people that are buying those houses are individuals that are rich enough to be able to buy those houses or rent those houses, it's relatively unclear as to why corporations really care about or are receptive towards the plight of the poor in those areas. Secondly, obviously, the state has the political incentive to want to revitalize, develop, or subsidize accessible housing on both sides of the house. That is obviously symmetric. The problem here is that on their side, you have to do it in very unstrategic areas. You have to do it further away from crucial facilities and amenities. They are already hijacked and already taken over by these corporations. Which on their side of the house, even if you do get some degree of state development and you get some degree of state revitalization program, they often occur in areas that are just very unstrategic, and therefore most of the benefits cannot accrue. In fact, on ours, we experience why this ban helps with regulation. Firstly, it frees up the amount of land from the state that the state is able to manage and plan far more effectively, which increases things like mobility, which increases the ability for the state to be able to coordinate between different areas, for example, in how they want to determine the economic policy. But secondly, it's far more targeted and far more effective, because when you have individual tenants and private home ownership, governments are able to far regulate it better, because it's the government going against the individual as opposed to their style house, where oftentimes governments are beholden to what corporations say, because corporations, when they bloat, become way too big to fail, which means that in terms of economic crisis, for example, when corporations do really bad things, it creates a moral hazard by which oftentimes the state has to bail them out in the process when they do really bad decisions. Secondly, they say the second mechanism is on competition. We explain that this cannot be the case because corporations don't want to compete in the same area, because one already has first mover advantage to develop that area rapidly, which means the more likely incentive of corporations is to find other strategic areas that have a lot of rich individuals or has the potential to have a lot of rich individuals and develop those areas instead, which also creates monopolies in those areas, which on their side of the house, not only do you get more monopolized areas that are geographically locked, but oftentimes the collusive natures of the real estate market and of corporations means that governments oftentimes just do not have the ability to be able to regulate these things on their side. Yang Chen says rich people own housing, but on their side of the house, they are far more willing to sell and collude with corporations to hedge their housing as monetized assets to gain even more money. So on their side of the house, it's a lot clearer that because they view the real estate to be a money-making machine, they are more likely going to collude with corporations in order for them to rent these areas at exponentially more expensive prices. But secondly, literally, their analysis here is that corporations have higher credit rating. How do you think they have higher credit rating? They hedge real estate housing as the way to say, look, guys, we are reliable, we are stable. That increases their credit rating. That allows them to get more loans and more borrowing. That allows them to be able to spend that money on other things that exponentially increases their ability to diversify and monopolize other sectors and other industries, which also just means that corporations become a lot harder on their side to be able to regulate. Because maybe you're able to regulate housing, but other parts of the industries are things that you find harder to regulate. Because corporations and governments themselves also have very limited political capital to do so. They say you can still rent, but it's unclear why on their side house you get affordable rent on their side. Because we explain as why is far better. Firstly, individual landlords often are not price makers because there are plenty of them in a particular building, which means it's a lot easier for you to bring in legal lawsuits or to enforce laws against like exploitative pricing or to have things like people collectively going against that particular landlord. On their side house, you're going against an entire corporation, which makes it a lot harder. But secondly, when you lose, there's just a chilling effect throughout the rest of them to be deterred from also just launching lawsuits against corporations also because they feel it to be a losing battle. Lastly, if these regulations are so effective, it then activates all the harms of deterring corporations from entering into the real estate industries on their side house also. So they must pick a bullet. Either these regulations are effective and therefore they don't get the benefit of corporations entering into those areas or tapping into different niches, but on their side, it's likely to be ineffective for all the reasons that I explained. So why corporations exponentially get larger and larger, and therefore governments become beholden to them. Actually, before that, anyone?
So like, can you just gauge the different profit models that corporations have?
Okay, so I want to just gut check this. They say that corporations will tap into rural areas. The next question they have to ask themselves is why? Because housing is very expensive. It's very expensive for you to build apartments. It's very expensive for you to develop and maintain those apartments. On their side house, you still have to charge some degree of fee, which means that even if these areas are rural initially or are very suburban areas, they become more and more gentrified and more urbanized in the process. Because the only way for government to be able to make some degree of profit out of it is by making sure that these they become a money-making machine. At the very best case, maybe it's true that rent becomes less expensive, but it doesn't engage with other analysis, which is that everything else becomes more expensive. The ability for you to be able to access basic amenities, the ability for you to buy groceries, the ability for you to go elsewhere, for example, all becomes more expensive on their side house because oftentimes you develop and you geographically lock that land, which means that land becomes a city in and of itself, which means it's a lot harder for you to be able to regulate the pricing or to have better competition because that one monopoly controls the entirety of the particular area. Lastly, I just want to note that their case sounds highly defensive. At most, they say that corporations can be held accountable. They thus far have provided no reasons why corporations do this better, why do they develop housing better, or any of these ideas. On our side, we explain that it's better for you to be able to have targeted regulation. We explain as to why private home ownership or individual tenants are a lot easier for you to be able to regulate, and therefore oftentimes don't fall into the same harm that this team talks about. This team is very scared because a lot of the case is corporations won't do the worst thing. But that's the entirety of the case. They don't explain why they tap into rural areas or areas that are like not very rich, for example. They don't explain why these areas are necessarily profitable for corporations to even tap into. But lastly, we explain why oftentimes this harms the state revitalization program because it consumes land in the most strategic area possible, thus running a lot of these lands to become a lot worse.
And now let's be real. 2 out of 3 of this Gulf team live in houses that they own, and they do not understand the no, 2 out of 3. Yeah. I live in houses that they own and don't understand the problems that the problems of people who rent and the growing demands of people who actually just want to rent. But I still want to question the main question that we have posited to this Gulf team is what is the counterfactual that allows people who have houses and to have that access to houses in the first place? Because the problem that we posited from opposition is that there is a growing demand of renters and people wanting to rent rather than wanting to actually own to engage in home home ownership. Everything that they told you about mostly is to tell you why you can just buy your houses, or there's just going to be houses for you to buy, but you don't exactly tackle the issues that we tell you, or how corporate landlord is the only way in which you are able to gain the most amount of rental properties for people to access in the first place, in which because a lot of people on their side cannot afford renting, right? Because the comparative that we get from the side of government doesn't work when it comes to individual landlords, right? Because individual landlords can jack up the prices. Raymond tells you that you can just bring one landlord to court rather than you can bring a whole corporation, right? But the problem is that what are you going to bring your landlord to court for? For setting prices too high? That's not a crime, because landlords own one property and they usually need to jack up prices higher because they don't have the economies of scale that corporations have access to, right? If your landlord is, and a lot of times the problem with landlords is like negligence, which you know later, right? And a lot of the problems that you face with like individual landlords is lack of standard that allows for people to have quality of life living, which a lot of time operates in a legal gray area, which people either are too lazy to bring these landlords to court for, because it's just a waste of time and effort. There's the same reason why Raymond had to move out of center stage, because it's just not worth it to bring his landlord to court for that small matter, right? So in this case, why we tell you, and let's make it extremely clear what is the case coming from opposition. We tell you that one, you're going to get regulations for these corporations. I'm going to explain later in my speech as to why regulation actually exists, actually can work effectively. With these regulations, you are then able to ensure that there are levels of rental properties that have access for people on different price ranges. They say that you're going to gentrify all rental properties and make it so you cater to all the riches of individuals. But let's check this, right? There's only so many rich people that you can cater to. Eventually, you will have to cater to the middle class or the lower class individuals that has to rent, and these are the anti-markets that people are corporations actually care about. Because if their idea is that corporations are profit incentive, want to make the most money, then someone has to cater to the poor people, right? That's why we have like car companies that make cheaper versions of expensive cars. We have all these other brands that make cheaper versions of their products, because this is a market that you ultimately care about, because they are voter based. But why is it that they do have political capital? Is they ignore the fact that these people make up like a majority of your population within your urban areas, right? Because a lot of your urban sprawl and the problem of overpopulation within urban areas is a lot of people coming from rural places that are looking for jobs. A lot of these people are the poorer individuals, and if they're able to make out numbers, I'm unsure as to why you are unable to get the political capital in the first place. Because their idea is that the horizontal expansion of corporations means that you're going to have infinite, exponentially more money in order for you to lobby against politicians. But the problem is that the argument of being able to lobby against another group works more effectively when you are the other motion that we talked about, environmental movement. Why is it more easier for you to lobby against environmental movement? Yeah. But if the governments themselves already have an incentive to actually care about people and what they actually want, because these are things that people are actually voting for, and they say that this is not a main issue that people vote on. Hey, it's so expensive to live everywhere because of the economy. Right. This is an issue that people mainly, the politicians already mainly campaign on. It's something that actually care about their voters. Because everything that Ryan and Marsha told you, how people cannot live, they cannot afford to work, they cannot afford to buy food. All of this contributes to how the society and the communities and all the rest can actually continue to function. Sure.
So if setting the price too high is not a crime, and you cannot bring individual landlords to court for this, then what regulations are you championing?
Okay. Brother, that's a question of law. We are creating law to make sure that your corporations can't things like rent control and rent freezes already exist. These things exist, but a lot of times there's no incentive for politicians in status quo to actually carry it out on a mass scale. And the reason why we tell you that there is the reason why is it that we are more likely to be able to do it on a corporate level is the understanding there's a growing demand for more of these rental properties that only these corporations are able to provide. And the reason why is it that we are able to, the reason why these like ranges of properties are likely to exist. Raymond tells you that they're going to all of these properties, even if you choose to cater to the lowest common denominator, they are ultimately going to be gentrified to cater to higher levels of clientele, which is something that doesn't make sense. We agree that maybe that the competition within an area doesn't really happen if you already have a far enough first movers advantage. But the mechanism that Ryan already explains to you as to why you will target the different models because your corporation have different business models is something that they haven't responded to. Why that isn't the case? Because if it is true that a lot of corporations are going to move on to eventually serve higher clienteles, then there are corporations that are going to take advantage by the fact that these lower income individuals doesn't have housing, and this is something that they can work towards to earn their money, right? Last thing is the idea on the idea coming from this side on how corporations are going to going to control the media to push the narrative that housing is not an issue and like the rent prices are not as bad. It's something that doesn't really make sense, right? I think there's a lot of analysis that Ryan already gave you how people are already disillusioned about like why or like all the bullshit that corporations are trying to push you. There's no reason why you would listen to a property development company to tell you that properties are not expensive and that you shouldn't worry about the prices of property and therefore you shouldn't vote against this, right? People are actively not being able to live. They see their house price going up. They're not going to believe someone telling you that no lah, your house prices aren't that expensive. You can still afford a house.
I get my constitutional 1 minute. Oh, sorry lah.
Scared.
I just need to think of a good Southern opening line.
I know I'm going to lose around, but
Oh. Yeah, don't say it. So lucky this recorded, man.
you responded up.
Okay. I don't know what fumes exist in Sarang to the point where Raymond can run this dog shit case. But like, oh my fucking god. I'm just gonna give a decently strong reply and I'll just explain why we win. Firstly, whether or not corporations have an incentive to want to cater towards the poor. Second, on capacity, why is it that corporations have a far better capacity in order for them to change and for them to afford better housing? First, is whether or not corporations have an incentive to want to cater towards the poor. There are two observations I want to make. First observation, they say individual landlords are better. Fine, I don't give a fuck. We agree, they're better lah, whatever lah. We'll just ignore all of Ryan's reasons to suggest why individual landlords, state ownerships don't want to cater towards the poor because they don't have capacity to, or that politicians only want to cater towards the average voter and not the poor rural areas. Like Les, you can bring individual landlords to court and they're bad. Yes, we agree. Second observation I want to ask is whether or not it's true that corporations also have an incentive to cater towards the poor. There are two reasons we gave. One, political participation. But knowing everyone here, like this isn't going to win me the debate. So we gave a second reason, which is assuming political participation doesn't work as per the analysis, or like you cannot bring corporations to court because they're very strong. We gave a second reason as to why corporations are not a monolith with various profit models. Like Raymond's case is just corporations just want to make a lot of money from houses. But we give nuance to explain how. Raymond says why, but we tell you why. Because urban cities are already dominated by the first movers advantage, as pointed out by Chan. It's because even if they're not profitable now, they can become profitable later because housing is a long-term game. So even if it's true that corporations do suffer a short-term loss if they move to, I don't know, not Sarang lah, but like to Kota Samarahan in Sarawak, like they still become profitable down the line. And the reason for this is because they have the capacity to weather these short-term losses. It's because they understand that housing is a long-term game. But this also seems to suggest why is it they can tap into other markets. Because if it's true that like luxury living is already so expensive and there's only so few rich people living in one city, this corporation can tap into affordable housing. They can sell millions of units with even slow and small slim profit margins, but in exchange for greater volume of profit. So on our explanation, we explain why corporations do have an incentive to want to be accessible. We explain why is it they have an incentive to cater towards poor or the average income of individuals. But what is the impact of this debate? This explains why incentive is symmetrical. If you're going to close one eye and let them get away with all the incentive reasons that they provided, you have to open the other eye and explain and agree with us when we explain why is it that corporations, per market mechanics, have an incentive to want to cater towards accessibility on outside the house. The second thing I want to talk about is capacity. Why is it that corporations are far better in dealing this? Oh my god, not a single line of response towards why is it that corporations can do this better. A lot of the analysis is just corporations are evil, like damn bro, I didn't know you had the Ryan Lafferty stock metaphor in your phone. But we explain why corporations are far better in dealing with these sorts of things. Firstly, it's just economies of scale. They have more ability to fund these they have more ability to rent as opposed to individual landlords which have to overcome the startup capital. We explain why is it they have the ability to garner loans as opposed to individual landlords in times of economic crisis or housing crises. Like they just cannot afford and have to sell a lot of these homes. We explain why is it that these corporations have greater ability in order to make sure that the houses are cheap and affordable, but we also explain why is it they have greater quality. The third subsidiary impact we also explain is to also prove why is it that this is better for the overall economy. Because if it's true that governments no longer have to subsidize housing, it also seems to suggest why is it that they can advocate a lot of their money into things like healthcare, welfare, education, which does benefit people on the ground. But the overall incentive that we provide is to just suggest why is it that outside the house you just get better homes, because on their side you have limited capital, you have limited capacity. Individual landlords are poor, they don't have the ability to make sure your rent or to make sure that your home is super nice or super good, because they just don't have the ability to. They may have the incentive to want to compete, but they just don't have the means to do so. On our side, we explain why corporations are far better in regards to dealing with this, because they can create greater quality housing on outside the house. For all those reasons, yeah, thank you.
If you couldn't see Ryan in the recording and it looked like he wasn't in the room because he was sitting down, don't worry. This is the exact same impression he gave to everyone in the room in terms of how much he was listening to the debate. Yeah, let's start with a framing clash on the corporations and who exactly they're actually selling to. Opposition's idea is hella delusional. They said people rent because cheaper. Therefore, the people in market have to be really freaking poor with negative credit. Therefore, corporations sell for cheap and your local B40 tenant can get affordable housing. The most obvious problem with this logic is it assumes that only people who care about saving money are people who are really poor. This is obviously empirically untrue. The majority of the economy is comprised of richer upper middle class to upper class individuals, as opposed to people who are drowning in debt and they cannot afford to pay for and they cannot afford to pay back like the debt with negative money that they have. So it's very unclear as to why, if they want to tackle like majority minority numbers and who exactly is dominating the economy, why exactly you also aren't referring to the average like Sunway student who is living in waterfront, constantly complains about the rent prices, but is still able to afford Apple Studio at Kenny Hills Breakers. Like, this is like something that the average person will be able to have access towards. There are people who live in M40 socioeconomic classes, people who have a decent amount of living, but still care about how freaked up the economy is. Kids are in here. Yeah, so the fact it remains that they are not actually considering like what exactly like socioeconomic spectrum is. But also, Raymond told you that incentives actually have a lot of like reasons for why you want to rent instead of home ownership, right? Because sometimes people have very short-term reasons for why they are staying in the area. Maybe you are studying in the area and you're not going to be there for long. If you can rent, why would you go out of your way to afford a landed apartment and own it? But thirdly, housing is elastic. If a local survey student has to find somewhere to stay and go to school, and every apartment within a 50-kilometer radius is owned by Jeffrey Ja's wallet, obviously you're going to go and rent the apartment as opposed towards stroke your own ego because you want to like own every single like bit of accommodation that you are in. This is much more viable analysis compared towards the idea that corporations would want to tap into some unseen market of the lower class because like they have never been catered to before. You know why the lower class is an untapped market, Ryan? Because there is no market to be had by people that cannot give you money. So this means that there is zero analysis coming in argument from the opposition on how they plan to achieve their eventual outcome. Why is this fatal? This eliminates the only benefit of better development, because they explain to you why exactly corporations can upscale significantly better in terms of development. Who cares about development if the ones who cannot access basic resources at an undeveloped level will not be able to get the slightest bit of access towards this? But next one, what exactly did we actually achieve? Because the model Chan gave to you from the start of the speech was a marriage between state intervention and individual landlord ownership. It was a very simple logic that was never actually directly disputed from the opposition here. We told you why it is far better for you to deal with an individual landlord because of the fact that there is a lesser power asymmetry compared towards you having to negotiate and having to take an entire corporation to court in the case of exploitation and collusion. This was never really directly combated. Ryan and Yan Cheng's only response was to wash, because they said individual landlords won't also cater towards these poor people. This only engages in direct price hikes, of having directly raising prices of these apartments. But it also ignores the main impact we also gave to you about how these corporations also horizontally expand, also gentrify the surrounding area, the surrounding community by creating a self-sustaining ecosystem of restaurants, of malls, of areas that aim to landlock these people and never have to move out, because these corporations want an entire environment of these people staying in this area. So this means that this is unique towards their side, because your individual landowner or your individual landlord may have enough money to afford a house, but they are not going to have the billions of dollars to invest into building Sunway City, bro. Like, they're not tycoons. Like, who exactly does the opposition think that they are? So this eventually means that even if rent is somewhat substantial on our side, we still want to scale, because the individual negotiation power that we have and the ability for us to avoid things like collusion on a corporate level and the ability for us to avoid things like gentrification is something that they would never get on their side. Your local CEO doesn't need to sell houses to the poor to target the market. He just needs to hire some Along to rob the homeless person for the 5 ringgit in his pocket. This is the incredulity of the opposition case, and that sounds like a pretty shitty income model for me.
So it's not to the